Eris had lived for 300 years before she met Daniel Carter in a small border town where different worlds touched each other and people from many places lived together in peace. She was a high elf warrior who stood 7 feet tall with silver hair that moved like water and eyes that glowed with ancient power, and beside her always was Ember, her bonded dragon whose scales shone red like fire in sunlight. Daniel ran a bookshop in that town, and he was different from anyone she had ever known because he did not fear her or try to impress her, and he simply smiled when she walked into his shop one day looking for books about human history. He was quiet and gentle and spent his days reading and writing and tending a small garden behind his shop, and when Ember flew overhead, he would wave at the great dragon and bring her treats, which made the dragon rumble with pleasure. They talked for hours about books and stories and life, and Eris found herself returning to his shop again and again, until one day she realized she loved this quiet human who saw her not as a warrior or a legend, but simply as Eris. Her people were shocked when she married him, because elves did not marry humans who lived such short lives. But Eris did not care, and Daniel promised to love her for all his days, however few they might be. They built a life together in a cottage between worlds, where Daniel kept his bookshop and Eris stored her weapons and armor in a room that gathered dust, because she no longer needed to fight. 20 years passed like a dream, and Eris learned what peace felt like, and she would watch Daniel work in his garden or cook dinner or read by the fireplace, and she would think that this quiet life was better than all the battles she had ever won. Ember nested in the mountains nearby and hunted and basked in the sun. And sometimes she would visit and Daniel would feed her and talk to her with respect, and the dragon grew to love the quiet human as much as Eris did. Daniel never asked about her past or the wars she had fought or the enemies she had killed, and he accepted her as she was in the present moment, and that was enough for both of them. But on a morning that began like any other, Eris woke to the smell of smoke, and it was not the good smoke from their fireplace but the terrible smell of burning buildings and flesh. She jumped from bed, and Daniel was already gone, and through the window she saw massive ships hanging in the sky like metal monsters, and they were firing weapons at the town below. Eris called to Ember through their mental bond, and the dragon answered with pain and rage, saying she had been shot from the sky and was grounded and hurt. Eris grabbed her armor that she had not worn in 20 years and her swords that had been sleeping in their sheaths, and she ran outside to find the town burning and people screaming and dying. Soldiers in black armor were everywhere, shooting beams of light that exploded everything they touched, and Eris began to fight, cutting through them with her blades, but there were too many. She fought her way toward where Ember had fallen, but then she heard a sound that made her freeze, and it was a human scream coming from their cottage. Eris turned and saw soldiers surrounding Daniel, and they held him with a blade at his throat, and a voice boomed from the ships telling her to surrender, or the human would die. Her heart broke, because 20 years of peace and love were about to end in blood, and she prepared to throw down her weapons to save him. But then Daniel looked at her across the distance, and he smiled a sad, gentle smile, and his hand moved faster than she could see. Daniel caught the blade at his throat with his bare hand, and blood ran down his palm. But he did not seem to notice or care, and with his other hand he pulled something from under his jacket. It was a sword, but not like any sword Eris had ever seen, because even from far away she could feel the power radiating from it like heat from a fire. The sword was simple and plain, but the air around it bent and twisted, and reality itself seemed to tremble at its presence. Daniel moved, and the soldier holding the blade died before he could blink, and the other soldier reached for his weapon, but Daniel was faster, and the man fell in 2 pieces. Eris stood frozen, watching her quiet, gentle husband covered in blood, holding a sword that glowed with pale blue light, and she could not understand what she was seeing. This was not the man who read books and grew tomatoes. and this was not the man who had shared her bed for 20 years. Daniel spoke, and his voice carried across the battlefield with power and authority, and he said the invaders should have left when they had the chance. Dozens of weapons turned toward him and fired, and beams of light screamed through the air. But Daniel moved, and it was like watching water flow around stones. Every attack missed or was deflected, and every soldier who came close fell dead, and Daniel walked toward the nearest ship, leaving bodies behind him. His face was calm, almost sad, like he was doing something he had done 1,000 times before and hated every moment of it. The invaders panicked and concentrated all their fire on him. But it did not matter because Daniel moved through the attack like smoke, and his blade danced and men died. When he reached the ship, he drove his sword into the ground, and blue light exploded outward in a wave that made all the invader weapons stop working. Their armor froze, and their ships groaned as their engines died, and the nearest ship began to fall from the sky. Daniel pulled his sword free, and suddenly he was on top of the falling ship, and his blade cut through its hull like paper, and there was a flash of light, and the ship broke apart. The second ship tried to escape, but Daniel raised his hand, and impossibly the ship stopped in midair, caught by something invisible. He closed his hand into a fist, and the ship crumpled like paper, and then fell as a twisted ball of metal that exploded when it hit the ground. The third ship fled into the sky and disappeared, and Daniel stood in the center of destruction, breathing hard, still covered in blood. The blue glow faded from his sword, and he looked around at what he had done. And then his eyes found Eris across the battlefield. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Eris felt like she was looking at a stranger wearing her husband's face. Ember voice crashed into her mind, saying that Daniel had just destroyed 3 warships alone, using ancient magic from Earth. Daniel took a step toward Eris, and then stopped, and the sword vanished from his hand as if it had never existed. He raised his empty hands slowly, and called her name softly, and said he could explain everything. Eris walked toward Daniel because she needed to know the truth, even though part of her was afraid of what she might hear. Ember landed behind her with scorched scales, and the dragon rumbled that Daniel had used old magic that should not exist anymore. When Eris stood before Daniel, she told him to talk and give her the truth and all of it. Daniel said his real name was not Daniel Carter, and his people had called him the Wanderer, and he was from Earth, which was supposed to be a myth. He explained that Earth was real and it was humanity's home world, but the Confederation had destroyed it 200 years ago, trying to wipe out humanity. Most humans had scattered and hidden and changed their names, but some kept fighting, and Daniel had been one of them for 2 centuries. He said he had fought and killed and made the Confederation bleed for what they had done until he could not take it anymore. So he found this quiet border town and opened a bookshop and tried to be just human again and not a weapon or a soldier. Then he met Eris, and for 20 years he got to remember what it felt like to live instead of just survive. The sword he carried was called a soul blade, and it was forged from Earth's dying breath, and it was bound to him and powered by his will and memories and rage. Eris asked if he would have told her the truth, and Daniel said he did not know because he had wanted to protect her from his past. But those invader ships were Confederation scouts, and more would come looking for him now. Eris felt anger and hurt because Daniel had lied to her for 20 years, but she also saw the exhaustion and pain in his eyes. She asked what he would do now, and Daniel said he did not know because the war had found him again. Eris reached out and put her hand on his and said that he should have told her, but she understood why he had not. She said she had fallen in love with the man who brought ember treats and grew tomatoes, and that man was real no matter what came before. Then she said that if the Confederation was coming, then they would not be fighting just Daniel because he was married to a high elf warrior with a dragon. Ember agreed with a rumble that shook the ground and said the Confederation would learn what happened when they threatened a bonded pair. Daniel looked at them both and said they were insane because the Confederation had fleets and armies. Eris smiled and said good because she had been resting for 20 years, and it was time to remember how to fight. The Confederation came 3 days later with 30 ships that filled the sky. In those 3 days, Eris trained and remembered her warrior skills, and Daniel trained with her, and they learned to fight together. Ember healed and flew reconnaissance missions and reported that the Confederation was bringing enforcers who were soldiers designed specifically to kill warriors like Daniel. The townspeople refused to run and said this was their home and they would defend it. Mayor Kate Sullivan organized volunteers and dwarven smiths made weapons, and even scholars and merchants took up arms. Eris and Daniel made a plan to use guerrilla tactics and hit the enemy from multiple directions, using ember portals to move between dimensions. When the Confederation arrived, they found the town apparently empty. Admiral Lisa Torres ordered enforcers to sweep the area and find Daniel. The enforcers found him standing alone in the town square with his soul blade drawn, looking tired and resigned. They surrounded him with a dozen enhanced soldiers and demanded he surrender. Daniel said he was sorry it came to this and that he was not trying to win, but just buying time. Then Eris dropped from the sky through a portal high above and landed on the lead enforcer with both blades extended. She killed him instantly and shouted for the attack to begin. Portals erupted everywhere, and townspeople poured out, hitting the enforcers from every direction. Ember burst through another portal and breathed fire across the Confederation soldiers, scattering them. Daniel fought alongside Eris, and they moved together like partners in a deadly dance, covering each other and exploiting openings. The enforcers tried to regroup, but every street was an ambush, and every building hid defenders. Above them, Ember engaged the Confederation air support and tore through their ships with elemental fury. Small civilian craft, piloted by volunteers, rammed the larger ships, sacrificing themselves to protect their home. The battle raged for 3 hours, and in the end, the Confederation retreated. They left behind 5 destroyed capital ships and all 12 enforcers dead. Nearly half the defenders had died, but they had done the impossible and made the Confederation bleed. Daniel sat in the ruins of their garden covered in blood and ash with his soul blade across his knees. Eris found him there equally battered and sat beside him. She said the Confederation would be back with more ships and soldiers. Daniel said he knew Eris said good because she was not done fighting and they had hurt the Confederation today and made them afraid. Ember landed nearby with blackened scales but gleaming eyes and said they had shown the Confederation could bleed. Daniel looked at his wife and dragon and the survivors gathering to honor their dead. He said that the Wanderer had fought alone for 200 years, but Daniel Carter had family and friends and people worth fighting for. Eris said to forget the Wanderer and let him rest, but if the Confederation wanted war, they would get Daniel and Eris Carter and Ember, and everyone tired of being afraid. Daniel smiled genuinely for the first time in days and said he married a peaceful life and got a war partner. Instead, Eris laughed and said he married an elf warrior and got 20 years of peace, so she made a better deal. Above them, more portals opened and refugees from many worlds began arriving because they had heard someone stood up to the Confederation and survived. They came seeking sanctuary and hope. Kate Sullivan said they would need more buildings and weapons if they were really going to stand against the Confederation. Daniel stood and offered his hand to Eris and said they would all help together. As the sun set, the survivors began to rebuild not just their town, but a resistance and a rebellion. At its heart stood a quiet human who had unsheathed his blade, a high elf who remembered what it meant to be a warrior, and a dragon who rediscovered her fire. The Confederation would send more forces, but now humanity had allies and hope, and something worth fighting for beyond revenge. Daniel looked at Eris covered in blood, and smiling, and thought he had found something better than peace. He had found purpose. And the Confederation was going to learn. There is nothing more dangerous than someone who has something to protect. The story of Daniel and Eris Carter became legend, and some say they are still fighting, still leading the resistance. Others claim they found peace again and disappeared to some quiet corner where dimensions fold. But everyone agrees the Confederation never found that border town again. And on quiet nights, you can still see a dragon shadow crossing the moon, and hear the ring of elven blades mixed with the hum of a soul blade, blue glow. The war continues. But it is not a war of despair anymore. It is a war of hope.